the state of Germany. He was the descendant of Prussian kings, whose military skills were feared. Nevertheless, he had not yet fought a war. Worse, he knew that his English relatives thought him inadequate, and had mocked him since his childhood. They would learn, he seethed. The world would learn. The Kaiser squinted and tried to see out the rain-streaked window of the small office on the second floor of the Chancellery. On the street below, a handful of people out on the ugly night scurried for cover from the cold, wet rain that had originated in the North Sea. They had, the Kaiser smiled to himself, just lost a minor war with the elements. He tapped his fingers impatiently on the window ledge. He was always impatient of late. If he hadn't been so impatient, he would have convened this meeting in the more convivial atmosphere of one of his residences and resolved matters over brandy and cigars. But no, he was in this dismal and sparsely furnished little room that would have better served as the office of a postal clerk than an emperor. Yet perhaps this way was more advantageous. The pomp of a formal meeting would have attracted the noses of the swinish liberal press, or worse, the socialist creatures who inhabit the Reichstag. Behind him he heard the door open and close, and the last of his invitees take one of the uncomfortable wooden chairs. He turned and confronted the handful of men. In the poor light of the small office, they looked nothing like the powers who ran the empire in his name and at his call. All of them, however, had von preceding their surname. This indicated their stature as Junker nobility, who came from that bleak Prussia their forebears had conquered from the Slavs so many centuries ago. Prussia was the military soul of the new German Empire. Of the 4 men, the Kaiser controlled 3. They were all older than he by at least a decade. That fact made him slightly uncomfortable, and he often had to fight to control his insecurities. Alfred von Tirpitz was the architect of the expanding navy they both wanted to be second to none, not even England's. Bald, burly, and grim, his face obscured by a long and full forked beard, he burned with an ambition for an overseas empire the Kaiser shared with a passion. Their navy was now the second largest in the world, although still dwarfed by England's. Count Alfred von Schlieffen, a slight, gray-haired man who looked more like a scholar than a soldier, was chief of the Imperial General Staff and led the Imperial Army, which was already second to none in quality and fighting ability, and second only to the Russian army in size. Since the Germans considered the Russians to be little more than barbarians, the difference in the size of their armies was not considered important. It was significant, however, that the mighty Imperial Army, with the exceptions of the short war against Denmark and the punitive expedition against China, had been underoccupied for almost 30 years. That was far too long. An army that does not wage war can soon forget how to fight. For that matter, he reminded himself, his navy had never fought in all its existence. Mustachioed Bernhard von Bülow was the Kaiser's choice for chancellor. Although some considered him a sycophant and a toady, the Kaiser thought him loyal and cooperative. Replacing other chancellors, particularly Bismarck, who had balked at implementing the imperial ideas, Bülow was ideal for Kaiser Wilhelm. The 4th person was the heavy-set, enigmatic, and mysterious Friedrich von Holstein, nicknamed the Jesuit because of his secretive ways and a preference for manipulation rather than confrontation. He had run the foreign affairs of the German Empire from his office in his home on the Wilhelmstrasse for more than a decade. The oldest of the 4 men, Holstein was both feared and respected, even by the Kaiser. Holstein's favored way of determining the will of the Kaiser was to avoid receiving orders. Thus it was rumored that the two had met face-to-face only a handful of times over the last dozen years, and it was only the veiled threat of a level of force that saw the angry and uncomfortable Holstein present at this meeting. Even so, Holstein was a loyal German. If the Kaiser commanded, Holstein would obey. In his younger days, he had been the protege of the subsequently dismissed Bismarck. This, too, caused the Kaiser to deal with Holstein cautiously. The Kaiser cleared his throat and began his prepared comments. "Gentlemen,"